So in the first part of this series, I left off with pretty much the entire outer carcass built. In this video, I'm going to tackle adding everything that's going to be inside. So the base, the back, and the partitions. So I'm going back to my quick sketch. Everything has very distinct dimensions because I'm reusing parts of those old dressers and they have to fit. And she's giving me some components from other scrap pieces of furniture, so that's why all of the dimensions have to be pretty much perfect. So I laid out where all the partitions have to be. Luckily, the drawers are in the center and then both sides are symmetrical, so I can pretty much cut all these joints at the same time and ensure they're in the correct spots. So I'm going to be attaching some my vertical partitions with some lap joints. Lap joints are a really strong joint. They're a really strong joint and they're a little bit faster to make than mortise and tenon. I originally was planning on making most of this with mortise and tenon, but as I got start more into the process of the build, I quickly realized the glue up would have been really difficult with mortise and tenons. The lap joints slide into place a little bit easier than mortise and tenons, and it would just make glue up a lot easier, and they're just as strong, and because they're on the inside, you won't see the joint lines, so it was kind of a win-win. So you can see all I'm doing is I had my pieces marked out and I'm using a stop on either ends of the saw, and I could flip these because, like I said, the centers are the same and then the edges are the same, so I can make all those cuts at the same time. Once I had all my cuts, I decided to do some bracing, which will not only hold up the base, but also pull the frame together and have some support where all of my vertical plywood partitions are going to be. These I decided to essentially make an open mortise and tenon so I could slide them into place. This was one of those examples. If I had these as a mortise and tenon, I would have had to put the base together, then try and lift up the whole thing and slide it into the tenons and the mortises for the end rails, which would have been a pain. So you'll see what I'm doing is I'm making mortises on these. I have everything mapped out so it's going to be the same. And then the tenons on the pieces that I'm putting in here can slide in from the bottom. I'm actually going to glue this upside down in order to do that. So this is pretty simple. Once again, cutting these mortises is really quick work with a mortising machine. A little bit different than the first process because I'm sliding the fence back in order to get it. But you can see with this last cut what I mean by these being open mortises. So this is just going on the base. It's not going on the top. The top can't really have rails because there's going to be two sinks and plumbing, and they needed to be able to work around the top, so the top is open. And then that's what that looks like in place. You can see my lap joints for my verticals are on the top and bottom, but only the bottom has those open mortises. So then I could go through once again with this yellow pine, rip it down to the strips I need for the base. The base is going to be 1/2-inch plywood, so when you were watching me cut those mortises, the chalk line I had on there accounted for 1/2 inch, so the base could sit on this. So I'm just going to go through now and rip all of this material I'm using for the verticals, for the bases, and then I could go through and add my tenons and or my laps to them. So for measuring out the lap joints, I'm starting on the edge because none of this is glued together yet. It's not perfectly square. I wanted to make sure that I get the most accurate measurements, which will be closer to where my partitions are, those end partitions. So I have it right on the edge. I'm marking where the top and bottom rails are, and that is where the top of my lap, the bottom of my laps are going to be. Once I have those marked, I can bring them over to the saw. At this point, I'm doing test cuts in the yellow pine because I could just go buy more yellow pine if worse comes to worse, and testing it out on that before cutting the teak. So once again, just to stop, I still have the dado stack in here, so it's a little bit faster work. Going about halfway through the material, I can cut those laps and then slide them into place. So that is how the partitions are going to fit in the front and the back. Everything's going to be flush. And once you have those cuts, they're all identical. You could see they just piece into place. And then I could go through and do the teak. The lap, like I said, is hidden on the inside, so the front, it looks kind of like a mortise and tenon joint. And then for the bottom, same thing. These are the tenons. Obviously, I just piece them out based on the width of the mortises, which is about 3/8. Could slide those in place, and you could see that chalk line, which accounts for my 1/2 inch base. Those are just my rough calculations for those. I map them out if you kind of want to pause them, but this is a very custom piece. I can't imagine someone would want to make something identical to this, which is why I didn't make drawings for it. And then once I had that, the clip before was just a test of that tenon. Once I had that, I could go through and rip this stock down and cut all of my tenons. Once again, the exact same way. One of the nice things about having the radial arm saw as well as a miter saw and the table saw all at once is you could have the table saw I could have set up for ripping, I could have the radial arm saw set up for making the laps, and I could use the chop saw to cut my pieces down to size. It just makes it a little bit faster. And then I could just make a bunch of those. There was going to be 8 of them, and then I could slide them into place. Now the drawer boxes are going to come from the original dresser. We're gonna have to cut them down. And you saw there was spacing, they're all gonna be the same size. I'm reusing some of the material from the dresser for this. And once again, I wanna make lap joints to fill out that inner face frame. And then these are gonna be inset drawers. Same process. The drawer boxes, the height is 7.5, so I just calculated out 7.5. I could use this stop, cut one of them, and since they're symmetrical, flip it and cut the other one. And then this is going to be on the back side as well, so you'll never see this joint. You'll just see the front of it, and I could flip it and do that as well. So those are my 2 cuts. Obviously, I'm going to do that on both of them. This teak was interesting. I've never really worked with teak before. When you cut it, the inside was gray, which was a little scary at first because the deck boards I had were really gray on the inside, but they oxidized very quickly and turned brown pretty much overnight after cutting them. So that was one of those moments where I thought I might be doing some dyeing or stain matching, but it ended up turning brown pretty quickly. And then for the pieces, the rails that go across, same thing. All I have to do is cut receiving lap joints on the edges, and then those pop into place. I didn't film doing that, but you could see the lap joint in the corners there. It's facing on the inside of the cabinet, so you won't see it. So then for my partitions, I'm using 3/4 inch plywood, and what I want to do is attach those with splines. This is a very big piece of furniture that spans quite a large bit. It's also be getting a lot of material on top of it. It's getting a stone countertop as well as sinks. So I wanted all these joints to be really strong. So I'm putting splines on all of my verticals. I'll put splines on the plywood I'm putting in place, and then the strength is going to come from the fact that all of that is then glued together and you're not really relying on butt joints. So that is what that spline looks like in place. It's obviously facing on the inside. I'm using scrap ply, so the plywood wasn't a true 1/4, which is why I didn't use a dado stack. It was more like 3/32. So all I have to do is mount the blade a little off center, send all my pieces through, and it cut perfectly. For the edges, I made this quick little, from scrap, this quick little piece that sits on the edge with a rabbet on it. You could see now it's going to butt out that base. One of the problems with frame and panel is the corners always leave an L shape that you have to work around. So to avoid doing that, I made that scrap piece on the corners. It's a rabbet, so it will hold up the end of that plywood, but also bring that dimension forward so it's flush with the inside of the leg, so I don't have to notch the corners of this base. So once that was in place, I could just cut the base, which like I said was 1/2 inch. I could slide it in place. I was thinking about weight with this, but unfortunately for some things I do prefer 3/4. It's just going to be a little bit stronger than 1/2 inch. You don't have to worry about flexing. So I want to put all my partitions so they sink in dados. Once again, doing this is also going to help square up the whole piece. So once I had my verticals in place in my base, you could see I drew marks from where those verticals hit, and then I could go through and put dados in there, and then the plywood will slide down and set in these dados. Just another added bit of strength, as well as an extra nestled glue joint. So pretty simple. I just followed my marks with the dado stack. Now the plywood I'm putting in here is 3/4, but the 3/4 plywood you get is never exactly 3/4. But I cut 3/4 inch dados for this because I wanted to have a little bit of play. You won't ever really see it if it's off anyway. So I could cut pretty much almost through on one side, but you saw I had to flip it in order to finish this because this is over 24 inches wide. And then once it's back in place, you can see how my partitions line up with that joint. And then I could go through and cut the plywood. The nice thing about that drawing is it's not a true drawing. I don't have any of the joints in that drawing on SketchUp. It's basically was all very quickly made butt joints in order for the client to have something to look at, but it was nice. I was able to pull a lot of dimensions off of it. So all I had to do was measure for the width and the height of this plywood, and they're all identical. You can see how they're going to slide in between those verticals and then nestle in that joint at the bottom. Like I said, none of this is glued together at this point. It's all friction fit, and it's holding together quite nicely. And then there are those partitions. Once the partitions were in place, I could line them up with the grooves in my verticals, mark that, and cut those receiving grooves in the plywood. So same process, like I said, it's not a true quarter, so I couldn't put my 1/4 inch stack in here. It's just that regular saw blade, a little off center from my groove, so I could send it through, turn it around, send it through again, and it gives me a perfectly centered groove. And obviously I'm doing this on both sides. Leaves a little bit of material on the bottom. I could remove that pretty easily with a chisel. And then this is just the spline material. This is all scrap. You can see most of it's going to be scrap from screw ups on my laser engraver. And then those splines will slide right into place. It now connects the frame to my panels, so it's going to be a nice solid joint with any visible hardware. And it's also going to help, like I said, square everything up. Now the top's going to have 2 sinks, so she asked for a couple notches on all these plywood pieces, which I'm just going to do with a circular saw pretty quickly. My camera dies right at the end of this, but I just make those cuts with the circular saw, and then it's notched for any sort of plumbing. I hadn't fully decided how I wanted to do the back when I started this, and then I decided to do the back very similar to the base, where I'm going to have grooves and the back fits into the vertical partitions on the back. But in order to do that, because now they're flush with the backer, I had to remove a little bit of material, so I did that as well before the glue up. The backer I start in this video, but I'll finish it in the third video. It will make a little bit more sense. I also decided to put a rabbet around the entire perimeter in the back, so the backer will sit in the frame. Like I said, this would have been easier if I decided how I wanted to do it before I started, but it's pretty easy with a rabbeting bit to go through and add this so that the backer can set in place. You can see it's not going to sit flush now because I haven't put the grooves in it. I was going to do that for glue up because I like to glue up things with the backer. It helps make everything square, and I knew with a piece of furniture that big that was going to be an issue, but I decided to wait till everything was glued together in order to do that. For these side panels, I'm using epoxy for 2 reasons. Like I said, there was old joints I was dealing with, so there were going to be some voids in this, and epoxy is going to fill those voids a little bit better than Titebond, but also because epoxy has this epoxy I have is a slow set epoxy. It's going to set up much slower than Titebond, which is about 22 minutes, and I could really mess around with it, get it square. You can see I'm checking for square here. It just gives me more time on something this large. The next day I could come in, I'm going to try and sand this as I go so I don't have to sand the whole thing at the end. You clean up the epoxy with denatured alcohol, but sometimes once all the clamps are in place, it's kind of hard to do that. So I just dealt with sanding it. You could see, it was hard to see in the previous clip, but you could see the rabbet that I put on the back side of this as well. So I dry fit this whole glue up together. I'm going to be using a combination of clamps and ratchet straps. I decided to glue this together upside down. You could see how I could slide those base partitions in and out. And also it wanted to wobble a lot because these things kind of act like a moving parallelogram before the backer's in place. So if I had my connection points on the floor, it's a little bit easier to glue up. Once again, using epoxy because I have a longer glue up time, which I needed for something like this. And I'm going to be gluing this up in sections. So I could put those partitions on, get that bottom ratchet strap in place. I'm switching over to tight bond for parts of this as well. And then I could get these rails in place, the front and the back, and then have everything clamped. You can see I have these plywood clamps on the corner. I put that there because if you don't do that, trying to get these ratchet straps in place, they want to keep sliding down. That's one of the bonuses to doing a dry fit. You kind of figure out all that stuff before you start gluing everything together, and I could just clamp this whole thing in place. Now the backer's not done, but I am going to prop it in place to use it to square this up. Like I said, once that backer's in place, it can't really move side to side as much. And then I could just slide the bottoms in place. You could see why I didn't want to use mortise and tenons for this. Would have been a real pain trying to get those in place. I could clamp all of these joints and let this set up overnight. So like I said, with all the clamps in place, it could be hard measuring for square. But I tried as best as I could to make sure this was square. The backer helped. Try to use an angle and as much of a tape measure as possible to square it up. The next day I could come in and take all my clamps off, flip it upside down. I do sand this. I don't think I filmed it, but I sanded off quite a bit of the glue. And then I could finish up this process. And the nice thing about these straps are because the material is like a polyester nylon, they pop right off no matter what adhesive I've used. So then to finish this up, I'm going to put the base in, put glue on everything, put that base in place, and then put glue on all the laps, put the partitions in, put the splines in, and slide the plywood in place. This is sped up, so this looks like a seamless process. This was actually a real pain. I tried doing it a couple ways before I settled on this one. The reason I didn't love doing this is sometimes when you slide those in place, all the glue kind of slides off the splines and ends up in the bottom. I also quickly realized I only had enough clamps to glue up 2 partitions at once, so this turned into a multiple day process. I did the 2 ends and then all of the middles. I didn't film a lot of it. It's pretty self-explanatory once you see how the first one goes in place, but I could take all of those clamps off, and then this is that final carcass. I sanded it up. I didn't film that because it's quite boring. And then you could see now what I meant by doing the backer the same as the base. Once this is all in place, now I'm going to put my pencil marks for the backer, and that will be the beginning of the next video.